welcome the final panel onto the stage and introduce John Cruikshank, who will be our moderator for this final session in the afternoon. The panel can start walking on. John is, the panel is looking forward, what's to be done, so really picking up from where the last panel left off, some of the ideas perhaps that John has put on the table as well. John is the publisher of the Toronto Star and the president of Star Media Group, and has worked extensively in the media at the CBC, at the Globe and Mail, at the Chicago Sun-Times, among many others. Thank you very much for doing this with us today, John, and I hand over to you.
Thank you so much. So, middle of the afternoon. This is usually time for my nap, and I see around me that I'm not alone in this. So, look, the exciting thing about this, you've heard all day, you've been hearing about what the problems are. They are extraordinarily well documented. Right? No question about that. This is the team right here, and I'm gonna introduce them momentarily. I'm going to tell you how we're going to fix it. Begin to talk about solutions. I think in some respects that we are finally entering a more optimistic period. We're finally waking up. We're waking up to the fact that the forces of globalization and how they have undermined nationhood, how they've undermined individual choice, how they've undermined the rights for all of us, are not inevitable. The crash of 2008 and the inability of major economies to come back have proved to us that this is a system that isn't without deep, perhaps fatal flaws. And in fact, we've got to think about new and different models. I'd like to celebrate today the extraordinary work that's in this report, because I think it's part of the waking up process. It's part of what shows us a little bit more about our ability to actually document our own circumstances apart from all of the other forces that seem to be so inexorable. And to look, again, at the kinds of communities that we really want, even if we're just looking in the negative, knowing what we don't want. But think about what we've seen just over the last couple of years. Think about the power of the Occupy movement. Think of the power of I Will No More. Think what we've seen in the States and in France, the rejection of the far right. It's not perfect, it's a start. It's the beginning of a waking up to choice. Choices we can make about our future. And I also, at this point, want to single out what United Way has done as part of that waking up. You see it here in what they've done. But think also of the turn that they have made over the last half dozen years. No longer to focus simply on meeting that urgent need. Still, they're meeting that need. They're still raising money for that. But they're doing so much more on focusing on awakening us to the choices we can make, the ways we can think about our circumstances, and I'm going to turn over the panel now and stop talking, how we can begin to make better choices. I have here with me Dina Ladd. Dina's been working to improve wages and working conditions for primarily workers of color, low-wage workers, and immigrant workers for the past 20 years. She's a co-founder and coordinator of the Workers' Action Center. She's working with predominantly low-wage immigrant workers, workers of color, in precarious jobs. And they face discrimination, violations of rights, and lack of benefits in the workplace. She's been involved in this PEPSO project as a community advisory member from the beginning. And she's going to talk to us on how research can connect to public policy to improve the lives of workers. I'm going to give her a chance to speak for a minute now, and then I'll introduce the others.
Okay, well, I'm really glad to be here today, and of course, talking about solutions is really important, and I feel like I want to get you all up on your feet and say, "Si se puede," yes we can, because you're all looking a little tired. But yes, I believe we can, and we can really change this around, and it takes a sort of collective power of all of us in this room to really start to move this conversation forward. I think that there are so many things that we can do, and I think it fights against this feeling that has been talked about throughout the day, and as John rightly pointed out, that that, you know, this is not just an inevitable conclusion that we are going to be in this world of globalization, and that precarious employment is our lot in life, and that the only choice that we have around us is this race to the bottom. That is absolutely not the choices for our communities. And frankly, that has been the mantra for the last 20 or 30 years, and look where that's got us. We have this report that clearly says, look at what's going on in our communities. Look at how devastated they are. Look at the kinds of conditions. Look at how our children are being raised. Look at the kinds of stress that are happening on our families. So this is a call to action. And there are many solutions that we can take, going from just some of the few things that I really want to put out there are, it's about rebuilding the floor of protection. Over the last 30 years, our employment standards, our basic labour rights have absolutely been stripped away and eroded for many of the workers in this province. And so you have massive gaps, massive cracks, which people are falling through because they're not protected by legislation, because they're a temp agency worker, or they're working on contract, or they're an independent contractor. Workers who don't get access to protections, basic things like minimum wage, basic things like overtime pay, because they're farm workers, because they're working in IT, because they're doing the kinds of jobs which are the new forms of work that we see in our communities that were not recognized in employment standards when they were really created after the Second World War. So really, what the government needs to do is to wake up to the reality of the kinds of conversations that we're having today. But it's up to us to make sure that they understand that reality, right? It's up to us to be talking about what's happening to our families and our communities all across this province, so that our local politicians and our local businesses know the kind of impact precarious employment is having, and the kinds of stress and really brutal realities that our communities are facing from this. So I think that there are many policies that are tried and true in different parts of the world that we need to look at. Just as the women's movement was pushing for equal pay for equal work, well, I'd say let's bring that back. Let's talk about equal pay for equal work, regardless of how you're hired and what type of job you're in. But if Faye and I are working at the same place and we're doing the same work, why should we be paid differently just because I'm working through a temp agency? Why should I get paid 40% less, have no access to drug and dental benefits, but Faye get that because she was directly hired by the employer? So these are the kinds of ways in which policy solutions can really start to rebuild a floor of protection, can start to take away the incentive of hiring people as a cheap labour strategy and as a cheaper way to hire someone, so that you don't have to pay the same rates and benefits if you hire them directly. So I think those are some of the things that I think we need to put on the table. We need to look at making sure, and I think this has been coming up throughout the day, also safety nets like employment insurance. I mean, we just had some policy initiatives that came in saying, well, we're actually going to force you now to take any job if you're on EI, and if you're not willing to take it, then we're going to bring migrant workers within 10 days and we're going to pay them 15% less. So what are those kinds of policies sending a message to us as workers, to us who are on employment insurance when we've just lost our job, that somehow we're not worth a decent job, that we somehow are not worthy of making a choice about the kinds of wages and the kinds of jobs that we should have the choice to take? And then, what does it mean for migrant workers being brought in as a cheap labour option? So I will stop there because John's looking at me, and because I can't talk for a while, and I want to say
And Dina's going to get more time to talk, but into this conversation, let me introduce Faye Faraday, who's a lawyer in Toronto. She represents civil society unions and coalitions in constitutional and appellate litigation, particularly looking at human rights, labor, administrative public law, and pay equity issues. She holds an innovation fellowship with the Metcalf Foundation, where she's engaged in legal and community-based research addressing the rights of migrant workers. Faye.
So in my comments today, I'm going to be focusing on migrant workers, who are one of the most precarious groups of workers in our communities. And I think one of the most heartening things that I keep hearing echoed today is our realization that no worker is inherently precarious. They are made so. Right? The exploitation and the precariousness we see are the outcomes of active policy choices by the federal and provincial governments. And knowing that those are choices, we can choose again, right? And I think that that's what this conversation is about today, is let's choose again. Coming at this as a lawyer, I think one of the important ingredients to add into the discussion is the way in which law operates as an active agent in creating that precariousness. And for migrant workers, that's a very real thing, in that the law actively puts barriers in the way of decent work and security, and ignores known practices that create insecurity. And it's time to start unpacking those. I'm just going to give really quick highlights in terms of what would security look like. I mean, we've talked a lot about insecurity, but I think that security has at least 3 dimensions. This is not a closed list, but it certainly requires, first of all, a real, robust, practical experience of workplace rights and decent work. It also requires the capacity to be able to enforce those rights when they're being violated. And it requires social integration and social inclusion. That's been a lot of the focus of this report, is the erosion of community. And so when we think about migrant workers, I think that there's 5 different projects. One is myth busting, which is that we refer often to temporary foreign workers. There's nothing temporary about the work that migrant workers are being brought in to do. It is core work in the local economy that can't be offshored in any way, right? Childcare, elder care, health care, growing our food, cleaning our buildings, serving at fast food restaurants, you name it, it's all happening locally. And it's enduring work. The only thing that's temporary about it are the workers who are brought in. For the workers, for many of them, they can be here for up to 4 years. That's not a temporary job in this economy. And what you get is this creation of a cycling working class of workers who are brought in under precarious circumstances, are here for a period and then are shipped out and immediately replaced with no penalty on the employer by another set of migrant workers who are doing the same jobs. So you've got a working class that has incredibly precarious status, has no capacity to unionize. Many of them are legally prohibited from unionizing, the majority of them in Ontario, and no right to vote, which is the other part of the discussion that we need to insert. Right? We've got an erosion of working class voice in the political process as a direct product of making this workforce temporary. Calling them foreign is a damaging, divisive label that tells us that we have no accountability for them because they're not us. But they are us. They're in our communities doing tremendously important work. And so I refer to them as migrant workers, which represents actually what they're doing. So what's our vision? That's the second thing. So myth busting, there's more myth busting there too. But what's our vision? We want sustainable communities. And sustainable communities requires looking at people holistically, not just as inputs in the economic process, but as whole human beings who are contributing to society. The rise of temporary labor temporary migration has been really something that's skyrocketed over the last decade. But we used to know how to do this, and it's not outside of our living memory, right? You let people immigrate with full status, with their families, from the get-go, right? You let them build our communities in the way that they should, that they're capable of contributing to our communities. That's a starting point. A second thing is to build the security of rights. There's a lot of holes in the labor legislation, but looking at all the different pieces of our legal structures that prevent people from accessing those rights. There's no point giving people a whole list of rights if they're not enforceable. And we have a system right now that puts impediments in the way to the enforcement of rights. Tied work permits, requirements that migrant workers live on the property of their employers. The fact that in our system, the onus of enforcement is put on the weakest actor in the system, right? That instead of proactive enforcement, we have a requirement that individuals come forward to raise complaints when the risk is that they are going to be deported, and they will be, right? So we need a shift in how we think about what our obligations implications are in terms of creating this system. How can we build security in that's going to resonate across the system so that everyone is lifted up? And we can talk about the details of that. But the last point is to think about opportunities, and I think that there's a lot of them right now. We have the federal government that has itself opened up the discussion around immigration. Rectifying the exploitation of migrant labor isn't on their agenda, but they've opened that door, and I think we need to walk right through it. The provincial government has also had its immigration roundtable. And again, that's another opportunity for us to broaden the conversation, to look at what do we need to do to fix this piece of precarity. And there are reports, like this one, that really contributed to creating the space to have more complex discussions about what's actually happening on the ground, and to pull people together to build the alliances that we need to go forwards.
Thank you so much. Third to our conversation is Jameson Stephen. He's the Executive Director of the Market Prosperity Institute and the Institute for Competitiveness and Prosperity. I've known Jameson for quite a while now in his capacity as advisor to provincial cabinet ministers, and most recently as the Principal Secretary in the Office of the Premier. During that time, Ontario became known as a public policy powerhouse in the country. Jameson played a key role in the development and writing of throne speeches, provincial budgets, and the Liberal Party platforms in 2007 and 2011. Before entering the public policy arena, he practiced law with Fasken Martineau Dumoulin. Jameson Stephen.
Thank you. So as the least accomplished with the longest title, that means I will speak the longest with the least impact. I look forward to that. First of all, what I'd like to say is I really do want to applaud United Way. As a policy one, more important to me almost than precariety around employment and income is data. If there's anything that's being attacked right now when deficits are happening across all governments, municipal, provincial, and federal, the absence of data to make good public policy is definitely an increasing problem. So this report is extremely helpful from civil society to bring that forward. I'm going to try to marry both my past life, which I continue to try to shake, with my current life, looking at issues of prosperity. So my questions would be, coming from the last panel, which I thought was excellent, what are the threshold questions that decision makers need to ask themselves to move any of these particular policy thrusts forward? And I wrote them down as follows. Sean Conway is a guy who I don't know if some of you know. Sean's hobby politics, in large part, him and a guy named Jim Bradley. And Sean would say, for what problem is this the purported solution? Was always his first threshold question when looking at any public policy. So my question would be, which group is most affected and which of these policies is likely to have the greatest impact? Second, to me the magic of the book Lincoln and the movie Lincoln, aside from it getting robbed last night, which is a separate panel, is the magic that he brought to the table of when to introduce policies for the greatest likelihood of success to be implemented. And what I would ask right now is, which of these policies that are being forwarded today or in these conversations has the highest degree of likelihood to be implemented? And some of the language that was used on the last panel about making this a middle-class issue, you can either approach that in one of two ways. Either with a lament that it is only now becoming part of the agenda because it is a middle-class issue, or let us absorb it as the Trojan horse for which it could be, and to get it to the people who really need this, need some of these policies at the back end. I would approach any of these public policies, because my fear would not be that they wouldn't be implemented, but they would actually anger that perceived self-anointed middle-class person, that you're helping an other, and therefore why are you not helping me, would be part of the problem in getting any of these policies forward. And then lastly is a point that was made, I believe, by the gentleman on the far right. Not only the cost, one of the elements that's maybe missing from the report is the cost of some of these recommendations, whether that be on business or on government. But what needs to be captured more often on the government side is what is the cost of not doing something. And I think more often as we move forward with any public policies in this province at the municipal, provincial, or federal level, it needs to be to capture what costs are being deferred or avoided as a result of any particular public policy, which is something, to be frank, that is very difficult to do. And I have respect for my old friends at Ministry of Finance, who I fought for a good 8 years, 7 months, and 13 days, not that I counted. But when you're up against a deficit, a dollar today is really tangible. A dollar saved next year or 2 years down the road is really hard for a public servant to calculate. As I look at your recommendations, I don't want to go through one by one, but when you are looking for places to marry with business, if there is a belief that they won't necessarily be part of the public policy generation aspect, minimum wage seems to be one of those places where there's a lot of rhetoric and myth, where data would be extraordinarily helpful. So the next time, if there is a movement on minimum wage, you could hear the debate, whether it be on CBC, I think, yesterday or the day before. It's going to result, one side says it's going to result in job loss, the other side says it won't have any impact. Might not be a bad thing to study instead of just shout from the rooftops. In the first bucket, the jobs as pathways to income and employment security, to me, the best hope there would be around the Employment Standards Act, both on the enforcement side and on the in strengthening the regulations and strengthening some of the laws there to recognize the employment that we currently have in this province. To add some real politics to this, two elements. If this is an agenda item for any government or any party in the minority parliament, you got one bill. Realistically, the chances of getting any more than one bill on this issue through this minority parliament, I would say in the next 12 months, is probably somewhere between slim to none, just based on what has happened over the first part of this minority government. Secondly, and the great thing to remember, there's going to be at least 3 elections, municipally, provincially, probably federally, within the next 24. So there's lots of opportunities to put this on the agenda at both the municipal, provincial, and federal level. The real opportunity, I think, for a rethink of rather than rewriting the social contract, which there is a recipe in there for that, which might be one of those within the next 24-month conversations, is human capital development. I think over the last 30 years, the drive on education has been to improve access to education, not necessarily the quality of education. And I think one of the main problems we've had from a productivity perspective is maximizing the resources that we have. Bill Davis was asked upon his retirement, what one gift would you give to Ontario? And he said, I would find oil at the bottom of Hudson Bay. Barring that, it is us. And any untapped resource in our people would be like Alberta leaving oil in the ground. So to me, human capital development, both in the form of apprenticeships, greater links between post-secondary education and a job market. We've reported in our last report the impact that literacy training programs actually have a far greater impact in improving someone's attachment to a workforce rather than a retraining program. Politically, a retraining program is a great thing to go stand next to. Literacy, turns out on the data, actually has a greater impact. Maybe it's a time for a rethink of both our post-secondary education from an apprenticeship and a training perspective for lifelong learning. I'm not going to throw my hands up in the air about the global economic forces that are causing income precarity, but at a subnational level, at least in my old job, I would say what are the conditions that I can actually affect in the short term to, while I can't change the global economic force, I can change the supports that I have around folks. Lastly, in the third section around social supports, and again, you can wrap this up as a middle class issue, you can wrap it up as an equity issue, childcare. And to me, when you wrap that into issues around human capital development, a strategy that says from 2 years old to work. We think of education as K to 12. If I could blow up the provincial budget and start all over again at $128 billion, my son's 3. My dad's 74. He's getting a lot more than my dad. And I think if we are going to maybe further this debate a little bit further as we think about things like a portable pension, dental and health, I would actually try to look at maybe some of the benefits that we currently give, and there's an equity in those. Right now in this province, when you turn 65, regardless of your income, you get free drugs for the rest of your life. When that program came into effect, the average lifespan of an Ontarian was 72 years old. It's now 82 years old. I'll be provocative, bump it to 75. To recognize that the drugs worked and people are living a little bit longer. The social safety net, I agreed from earlier. There is some strain on it, but maybe needs a bit of a rethink. Lastly, I would say it was raised by one of the comments in the hall. A couple of things that I'd ask folks to think about. Number one is cost, and I don't mean that from we need to balance the budget. I mean that from who's going to pay for what. It's a real simple question, and also what costs are you avoiding if you invest in something. Number two, I think we don't discuss the intergenerational inequity that is starting right now from the pension and benefit aspect that was raised before. We ignore that at our peril, because right now one of the reasons that the under 40s aren't voting is because they don't see the benefit to it. And then lastly, I would say, if there's one issue that I'd throw on there, if I were still in my old job, the 2 issues that I'd pull from a macroeconomic lever is education, post-secondary in particular, and transit. get people to work a little bit easier, get people to work a little bit faster. These might be some of the more solvable problems that will indirectly affect precarity rather than some of the more direct ones. But with that, turn it back to you, Joe.
Great start. I was very struck by Faye's wonderful statement that engagement. It wasn't some kind of global economic karma that created the precarious situation of workers here in Ontario, here in Toronto, here in our backyards. It was us. We made a bunch of decisions that made it this way. So the question I really have for this panel, and we've already heard some of this, but I'd like to hear more from each member of the panel. Okay, we've got some great ideas about how we unmake these circumstances and move in a different direction. How do we get them onto an agenda for action? Is that something where we should be looking to the courts? Should we be looking to the legislatures? Should we be looking to the streets? What's the way to begin to make change now?
Well, I mean, I think it's all of those. I think that there's many ways in which our communities participate in active engagement, and I think that obviously for the Workers' Action Centre, we're absolutely pushing forward a legislative agenda to rebuild the floor of protection for workers, and looking at ways in which we can find methods to bring back security to workers, and that absolutely needs to take place. But those issues don't go on the government's agenda without active mobilization from communities and people coming out to talk about what they're facing at work and the issues that they're willing to fight for. And I think that the broader issue here is what is our vision for our communities? What is our vision for our families and our work? People say, the refrain right now is, those unionized workers, they have a pension. Why should they have a pension? I don't have one. Why should they have benefits? Why don't I have one? I think we need to flip it to say, they have a pension. Why don't I have a pension? They have benefits. Why don't I have a benefit? Why don't I have what they have? Instead of it always being about take. And I think that that's where the sort of where a lot of us have brought into the kinds of divide and rule strategies that I think are very common in our workplaces, right? Where we're pitted against each other. Who's in the temp jobs? Who's in the contract jobs? Who has the better jobs? Why don't I have access to that? And I think those are the hard conversations that we need to have in our community organizations, in our communities, in our schools, in our workplaces, to rebuild those alliances, to really start putting forward a strong vision of, we believe in decent jobs. That's why we did that little video that you saw this morning, is, how do we start talking about this stuff that rebuilds the nature of the conversation, that rebuilds the kinds of dialogue that we need to have so that, people don't start thinking, well, I got a one-year contract. I'm doing really well, and I've never received benefits. Who needs them? Until of course they're my age, and then you're like, I need them. And so so I think it's really trying to have those conversations with a lot of people, but really organize and put it on the agenda.
In the race to the bottom.
Absolutely, and really take on the race to the bottom and say, no, that is not what we are not. This is not acceptable for our communities. This is why we can use reports like this to sort of say, this is not just, this is not just feelings. Look at the hard evidence here that shows the impact, the stress, the health issues, the quality of life issues, and the fact that people also aren't paying the bills and are getting further into debt. And if we don't play that role of mobilizing our communities and of changing the conversation and then moving that to action, we're just going to continue this trajectory.
So you have used the courts. What do you think about that?
As a lawyer, I think it's important to be skeptical about using the courts, or to know that it's a very particular kind of tool, and it works well for some stuff, but it works really poorly for other things. So it's an important tool to use strategically in terms of making change, but I agree with Dina that I think that this action needs to be happening in all those spheres simultaneously, and the same message has to be going out in each of those forums. But to focus on the legal point, one of the difficulties with law is that it frames every difficult social issue as a really simple binary, right? It's either this or this. But I think one of the important things that we need to take out of all this research is understanding what is the system that's operating, right? You have to map the full system, see what are all the different pieces in it, and figure out where are the points of leverage that are going to have resonance throughout the system. So if I can just, with migrant workers, if you look at all the different laws that constrain their system, right? We have federal laws that prohibit certain groups of workers from accessing permanent residence, right? We have two different departments that are dealing with, one department, CIC, authorizes employers to hire migrant workers. HRSDC gives the work permit. They don't talk to each other. But then the regulation of work happens provincially, and there's a lot of different pieces in there that constrain workers. A court case can't talk about all of that. It can't capture all of that. It can isolate particular moments of it, but those are never going to shift the system because the system has its own energy that has to be dismantled at a system level. So you need policy forums like this and community organizing to be able to keep that holistic view at the forefront and to understand that you need to have complex, different inputs, multi-inputs into rectifying a system, and that you might need different solutions in different contexts. So there's not going to be a silver bullet or a one fix for everything.
Jameson, your party succeeded a party that spent most of its time taking government apart and, frankly, making the community ever more vulnerable to global forces.
I'm nonpartisan now. I have no idea what you're talking
I
about.
have absolutely no idea. I know that you're now a nonpartisan figure, but could you reflect a little bit about rebuilding the power of community, whether it be through legislation or in other forms?
Sure. So, three things. Number one, I think the number one thing we need to further debate is the progressive voice in journalism, as I said before. No, but seriously, Toronto Star has given voice to this report, and there's something to be said for that. So I would say, telling tales out of school, there's many in this room with whom I've worked over the last 8 years. And while both the last speaker and I've heard others lament many of the things that weren't done, I think there actually was quite a bit done, particularly on the poverty agenda over the last 9 years. There's always more work to be done. There are always more wrongs to be righted. But I think if there's four pieces of advice I can give on any particular policy to go forward, it's quite simply this. Broaden the coalition of people, narrow the ask, make sure you have multiple vehicles through which you can produce the same results, whether that be legislation, legal, policy, funding, the rest. And then lastly, be willing to put something on the table, whether that be an existing program that might not necessarily be working, that you're willing to dial back on for the sake of making sure those dollars go somewhere else, or data collection. If it turns out after 2 or 3 years this isn't working, we'd be willing to dial it back. I always found it really easy. Government can find it easy to say no to 17 voices asking for 17 different things. It's really hard to say no to 17 different voices asking for the same thing. The best, I would look to other examples on where agendas have been successful. One that I always like to point back to is Michael Wilson's insertion into the mental health debate. Until corporate Canada decided that depression was also a business issue, no one talked about issues of depression. Now you have Bell Canada running multi-million-dollar ad campaign with the most decorated Canadian athlete in the history of our country talking about, let's talk about mental health. So look to those places where there actually has been a paradigm shift in a conversation and steal from them. And so the only reason I would argue in this group that you want business to be on side is because without them, I don't know if you move the agenda forward. So find that coalition of people that are willing to pick up the banner.
I want to say a little bit about engagement. it's again, one of the great things about actually having a little bit of data, and especially a report like this one, that also is accompanied with real human stories about what's happening to folks in our communities, is we can then, as a media, create stories that can engage readers and listeners and viewers. Believe it or not, it's not all that easy all the time. It's not hard to write stories that people won't read about the economy. And as I think most of you know, we have several decades of experience. Right? The crash of 2008 was a staggering surprise to the Wall Street Journal, the Globe and Mail, to the Financial Post of London, folks who apparently were actually paying attention to the world economy, and certainly to all of their readers. So it's hard to write comprehensively, and certainly to write in human terms to engage people. And I think, and that's why I asked the question about how do we get an agenda where we've got some constructive. The answer is, how do we get it to an action, a form that action can follow, and engagement is a piece of that. It's getting people's attention, getting their passion, getting them passionately involved in that cause with you. With your permission, I'm going to ask this audience, many of whom you know, to collaborate with us in this conversation. We're not using that one. Please. Sir, the mic is coming to a place near you.
Well, there was a couple of shout-outs earlier for the idea of a housing benefit. So just on the income security side of the equation, I think we have a social assistance system that we're talking about reforming. There's basically three elements within a social assistance system where we pay out money for in terms of the cash that goes out to people. It was a child benefit, a basic benefit, and there's a big embedded housing benefit that costs about $3 billion. It's within the two programs called ODSP and Ontario Works. And the Ontario Liberal government did almost the impossible by bringing in a huge Ontario child benefit, very, very successful, much more popular benefit than anything in social assistance. So to riff off what Jameson said, I would say we have an existing program embedded within social assistance. It pays over $3 billion to 6.6% of our population. And yet we have many more people, about that many people again, another 6% who are in the working poor population, and an awful lot more who are in precarious employment. So if we're going to try and look at a number of labor market and regulatory types of initiatives and interventions that we've talked about, but on the income security side, and again, thinking of the Sean Conway piece, is that if you want to stop and really solve the issue of homelessness, if you want to take down those long lists of people who are trying to get into public housing, if you're trying to help people out and be very surgical about where you're going to help them in terms of their income security requirements, then I think as part of the social assistance review and reform process, which is now in play, the Premier has put it in the thermal speech, then we really ought to look at that housing benefit as a possible solution and really give it some legs. Thanks.
Thank you. Responses from this panel?
Well, I think for the workers that we work with, you've got a constellation of issues that are absolutely fundamental to their existence. Absolutely the housing benefit, there's issues of childcare, there's the issue of minimum wage, which has been frozen for 3 years now, and then there's the issue of people who are making minimum wage and not even getting minimum wage because their rights are not enforced in the workplace, and so people are not even getting paid their wages. So I think the conversation, which I think, as has been sort of talked about, is how do we put forward an agenda that gets at all of these issues, and not that there's going to be 17 asks, but that there has to be a strong, united force in our communities for issues of housing, childcare, but I think also what people are also raising and what we are bringing forward is those real access to decent jobs. And so I don't think we can put things against each other. I think we need to put together a holistic picture of, again, what our communities are facing and what the people's lives are that we are dealing with in our communities. And I think housing is an integral piece to that. But in order to, pay for housing, people need to access to decent jobs. I mean, it's like a chicken and the egg, right? So how do we put together as a community a package of real concrete demands that can really make a difference in our communities' lives, right? And I think that that's really the big agenda here that we need to get our act together on.
And I think that this is, I agree with Dina, and I think that, when we talk about building alliances and working together on this and making sure that all the campaigns resonate with the same core message, we can have a number of different asks in different contexts that all come back to the same message of sustainable communities, sustainable good jobs, decent jobs. And it helps, I think it can help build that platform where everyone's pieces can be part of it, building the same message of the health of our communities.
A couple things. I think it's a great point. I think if you asked Frances, so working with Frances was one of the last things I did in my last job, and I think as she went out and did her consultations, what she found was the pressure came at her basically from three angles. One was greater supports for housing, greater supports for food, and greater supports for income. And you could almost bucket the groups into one of those three slots. And I thought she was actually, both she and Minnie are very elegant in the report. First, number one, if you don't understand the system, what a great report to read. It's a primer for every MPP when they walk in the door. But it's also a great sense of how you try to not necessarily play them off against them, but how they intertwine. Number one. Number two, this is where I still can have my partisanship. I would ask whether the federal government on issues around housing, an agenda around portable health benefits, EI, and housing would be three elements that I would really think still do fall under a properly functioning federal government. But lastly, I guess my pitch around where maybe the word we're looking for is narrative, around what's the storyline that we're trying to tell. The reason that I chose to go to a place that has the word productivity in it is that I think ultimately there's a throwaway line in the Don Drummond report, almost in the opening paragraph, which says the Ontario economy is going to grow at a rate somewhere between 1.8 and 2.2% for the next 10 years. The next line doesn't say this, but it might as well have said, and here is the hellaciousness that shall follow. And I thought someone needed to be working on getting that up to 2.5 to 3, instead of trying to protect those things that are going to be under attack if we only grew at 1.8 to 2. And maybe the thing that cuts across all political agendas, left, centrist, and right, is if we can grow our economy a little bit more, maybe it makes our choices a little bit easier. And so how do we get more people working at full employment, getting full pay so they have more money to buy more things? There's a virtuous circle. It's the economy, stupid. If you make this about an other, it's easy to defeat. If you make it about all of us, then it is unstoppable.
One of the extraordinary things about that vision, and the negative side is reflected in this report, is that as people have less, as their lives grow more precarious, their capacity for citizenship shrinks. Right? Their ability to be full citizens, participating in the lives of their children, in the lives of their community, the lives of their parents, shrinks. They lose that capacity. The virtuous circle that James is talking about, that's a capacity that's regained. So there's a growth that is not merely economic, but is actually a growth in the quality of our citizenship itself, which is really profound. Other questions, please?
So I think that this is an amazing report, and it's incredibly comprehensive. And so to get to the kind of changes that we want to get to, it's not like one legislative head, right? So it's how, so my question from the very beginning, and I'm sorry it took me this long to ask it, to what extent is this participatory research, right? Where you're keeping your participants involved, engaged, and building that army of people who, as you do these changes, multiple small changes, you can get it to where you need it, where you're going to actually make a big change, right? Because one bill ain't going to do it, and neither is one legislative strategy. But getting the 5,000 people that Wayne promised us for the next meeting, that's a start. So I mean, like, to what extent did the people who planned this research make it into something which is much more participatory about how do we report back to the people who are engaged in the research?
I mean, I think that's definitely a question for the research group around PEPSO, and I think that's one of the reasons why they're having this forum, is to start to say these are the results and this is what we're finding. And I think all of us are connected to many different communities, and I know that, communities across Ontario, we need to not just have this conversation in Toronto, it needs to then also happen in many different cities in the province, because these are issues that I'm definitely hearing everywhere, in terms of cities being devastated by massive job loss and the massive increase of precarious employment and these kinds of stresses. So this is a conversation that is happening in many places, but I think that the kind of mobilization of people who have been talked to in the research, I think that the case studies and people that spoke earlier today, I'm sure that there are sort of plans like the photo exhibit and bringing people to the table and to the community. But I would say that the biggest issue, though, is still for all of us in this room. Are we going to, how do we make sure this report is not just a report, right? That it's not just a flash in the pan, that we get fantastic media coverage for a week, and that's really brilliant. But then what happens, at the end of March? What happens in June? What happens to the communities that we are accountable to, that we have to fundamentally take responsibility to make sure this report moves forward and gets on the plate of every, government person that we know, of all the people in our communities where we're having these conversations, and that we're connecting them to the campaigns that are out there that are pushing for better labor rights, pushing for better housing benefits, pushing for better childcare, pushing for the minimum wage to get increased. That is our responsibility, right? To make sure that this report doesn't just become another report. And I think it speaks to the kinds of engagement and the organizing we do in our communities, so that this is the long-term struggle here, right? It's taken 30 years to have our rights completely, kind of deteriorate to the point that we have these kinds of statistics. So this is about rebuilding the floor of protection. This is about rebuilding the connections between unions and communities, between people who have jobs and who don't have jobs, people who are suffering from racism and discrimination, who are totally marginalized and who are being brought in from outside Canada and being completely isolated in their work. So these are all building blocks that we have to ourselves take as organizations, as people representing our respective communities to move forward. I really feel that we have that responsibility.
Yeah, two things I'd say. Number one, if I were running for something, and I knew I started off at the foundation of community poverty groups, United Way and Organized Labor, I'd like my chances. Number one. Number two, maybe you want to think about it in a Maslow's hierarchy of social change. What are the foundation elements that are the first step, that lead to a second step, that lead to a third step, in the sense of, as well, the decision maker is able to say, okay, I'm able to move on step one, but I'm not necessarily delivering tomorrow on step two. My least favorite press release when I was in government used to be, we applaud the government on its great first step. I'd literally hurl them across the room, and billions of dollars just went out the door, great first step, and I'd go for a long walk. I think the OCB is an example. There's a ready-made group of folks, some of whom are here, who, political parties don't think, at least the one that I work for, when I worked for it, did not think they were the holders of all great ideas. And I'm still a guy who believes in platforms and believes in good public policy winning political elections. And I still think that can be the case.
Other questions? Obviously, you will have a very full day. Oh, here we are. We're not done yet. Can we have a microphone over to this gentleman? We're coming back to you, sir. Please.
I was wondering if you could explore a little bit more this, what I find this kind of provocative issue that you raised about having business on site and making this an issue which is a middle class issue. Precarious employment as a middle class issue. And I can't put my finger on why that's sort of a bit uncomfortable, but I'll tell you one of the reasons is that I'm thinking about the whole issue around diversity and how we approached it. And how initially it was about really employment, like really, having access to equal and fair workplaces. And then it became about the business case for diversity. And what that allowed us to do, what it allowed people to do, was really to think of diversity without linking it to racism or sexism. To think, oh, it's a business case, it's good for everybody. We don't have to talk about racism, we don't have to talk about sexism, we don't have to talk about why we need the business case for diversity. We can just talk about how it's good. So sometimes I just wonder, in this case, whether that would maybe do a similar thing with precarious employment, not allow us to talk about why does it exist, by moving it off the, I guess, what I see as the core issue. Why is it that we have people who are part of the working poor? The people, so moving it off the income, the low income issue. So.
Because I think the definition of precarious employment in the report is broader than low income. Like when I read the report, you're talking about 47 to 50% of people. Just math makes me go to a place where it's the middle class, number one. I'll use Obama as my example. The campaign that Obama ran spoke, like most modern liberals do, about a lot of marginalized people. Gay and lesbian rights, immigration rights, and the rest. The State of the Union address was about the rising middle class, a saying that was used at least 5 times during that speech. Because to those legislators, that's language they can use back home. So I guess I'm trying to marry up appropriate language that is going to be still in electorally acceptable with a policy outcome that is desirable. I don't think you need to water down the one to achieve the other.
I would say for myself, and I would say it's like, strategy to move forward the work that we need to do. I mean, and I think that this is something that we're struggling with, and I'm looking at Jameson and I'm thinking, next time I go meet with the Minister of Labour, maybe I should take you to talk about employment standards with me. So you're going to be getting a call from me, that's for sure. So I think the thing is that,
you make new friends everywhere.
Absolutely.
The Integrity Commissioner says I can't talk to anybody.
So, I think that there's been some interesting campaigns in the United States where employers have actually come to the table and said, you know what, I want to pay people decently, I want to pay them, and I'm going to back off from, there are pressure campaigns to make employers do that, and then there are employers that sort of want to be the good employers, and so I think that, we know through the campaign we did to raise rights for temporary agency workers, there were temp agencies that actually came to us and sort of said, we actually want to pay public holiday pay, but we know that there are temp agencies out there that don't pay public holiday pay, and the client companies want to use them because it's cheaper for them. And so they're saying, we're going to be put out of business, right? And so I would say that one of the business arguments then for this is, those good employers that who will allow their workers to unionize if that's what they so choose, and will not run anti-union campaigns that support following basic labor standards and improving benefits for workers. If they want to come to the table and say, we want to do the right thing, and we do not want to be undercut by employers who are not paying wages, are not paying public holiday pay, are not paying the kind of basic rights, then fine, let's bring them to the table. Unfortunately, we haven't seen many of those employers want to do that. So that's where I think in your smaller communities, if there are decent employers who are willing to come to the table, employers that are also part of unionized workforces that can come to the table and say, we have a unionized workforce, we believe in decent wages. We had I think there was a Canadian Tire warehouse owner that came that was very active in the public discussions at City Hall about getting rid of public holidays, the right to work on public holidays, and was very much in support of making sure people got that day off, right? And that his workforce, and he believed that he didn't want to have people work on public holidays, and that things should be open. When do we find those allies and bring them to the table? Again, I am in search. And I think, we are open to hearing from them. Any of you who may be out here, please let me know. So I think that that's one of the things that I think we need to do. Because, if you can't have employers say that, we think employment standards should be enforced and people should not be treated this way, then what sort of message is that saying to our communities? But that's actually what's happening out there. Employers aren't saying that. So that's a problem, right? That shows that the race to the bottom argument has really ruled the roost here, right? So we really need to then push employers to do the right thing, to say it's okay to unionize, that union jobs are decent jobs and are good jobs and they're actually better paying jobs, that employment standards should be enforced and that is the way to go, and that you should be bringing workers and paying them and making sure they get status upon arrival. Like, those are the kinds of arguments and discussions we need to be having with employers and bringing them to the table. Whether they'll come willingly or not is the question.
But I think Faye has made the really important point that if you create a regulatory environment where good employers can't act decently and stay in business, then you've got a really crappy regulatory environment, and you need to remake it again.
You do, and I think one of the I share your discomfort around drawing in the middle class, watering down the message? Is it depoliticizing it? And I actually think that there's ways to make it to help it amplify the real politics of it. And I think about that in terms of, like I said before, this move to temporary labor migration is a very new thing. There are many of us in this room who immigrated here with status, whose families immigrated here as families with status, who worked solid working class jobs and have built our communities. And building that solidarity between those of us who are here and those of us who look like us, who aren't allowed to come in, I think is a really powerful, has potential to draw in people who haven't seen this as their issue. But if I present with the fact that, you wouldn't actually be allowed to come here now, how do you feel about that, right? Is a way to tap a community that may be comfortable now, but needs to perhaps be woken up to, perhaps you can use that, your security now, to help others like you.
I see the end now sign, but I haven't been able to talk for 9 years. So one quick thing, if you do have trouble with the middle class aspect, I would make that separate and distinct from getting business on side. And only for this reason, when you think about, it's harder for a business to say no to a fellow business person. There's a public shaming aspect to that you don't bring to the table if you don't have them with you. When I think of the diversity issue, I think of a guy like Gord Nixon, who has been front and center within the banking community to try to diversify his community. It's a hell of a lot harder for the other banks to say, no, it'll water down the quality of my workforce, I've got labor issues. If Gord's saying next, you're nodding, no. And so just if the middle class part is troubling, then I'd at least latch on for a couple of progressive business folks. Sorry.
We're talking.
I'll take that.
Just before we end now, I have 2 rounds of thanks. First, on behalf of this committee, I want to thank you for your engagement and participation. And on your behalf, I'd like to thank